there should be some streaming action going on too.
And we need to put something inside here, right?
Let's see if we can.
Or in the worst case, I can like use here, but of course, having it in hand would be more straightforward.
Yeah, you can forward.
Excellent.
All right. Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Wojtek Belka, today's top speaker. Wojtek is a familiar face to many of you. He has been a postdoc in Tamásszékely's élvonal shorebird group for a couple of years, and now he's a faculty member at the University of South Bohemia in the Czech Republic. He has been studying shorebirds, has done really nice publications. The latest one is an opinion piece in the Transient Ecology and Evolution journal about this question, whether it's still adaptive to make long-distance migrations to northern latitudes. And I think Wojtek will tell us whether it is or not. Really looking forward to this talk. Thanks for coming and giving a talk.
Thank you very much for a nice introduction. It's my great pleasure to being here with you again after a few weeks or months, depending which one of you. And today we will cover the topic of animal migrations, and we will have a look not only from perspective of nice shorebirds, even if there are some prominent examples, that's for sure, but we will keep it more broadly. And we will ask whether it's still beneficial or not for many animals to migrate. Well, you know me well, but for those who not, I have been lucky to spend some time in various institutions and places, including Elvonal here, and we are still running the Elvonal. That's that I am right now in dual position, helping Elvonal here, and at the same time being able to establish my own group at University of South Bohemia in the Czech Republic, actually my home region. Well, I like polar regions as well as some tropical ones, and you know that sometimes in the Arctic many interesting things can happen. You can, for example, stumble over the mammoth tusk in Siberia, or spend wonderful times going around by Hvězděchod, and we could spend talking hours about such experiences. Quite recently we expanded to tropical regions too, but even there we quite like, and shorebirds do like, some special environments. This is Andean Antiplano, 4,000 meters, 4,300 elevation, and those small like steams are not smokes from the villages, but small tornadoes starting to emerge every afternoon in this high Antiplano. There are great places and great species to study as well. In general, I do like not only concentrating on cutting-edge science or research investigations, but I do care about the outreach and conservation implications. That's that we do a lot of excursions for public, debates with public, teaching at schools, and luckily we combine quite well the fieldwork targeted investigations, ideally at our own field sites, together with data collected according to standardized protocols across large scale, across many populations. That's exactly what we are doing in Elvonal. And at the same time, we really like to step back and see the more broad comparative perspective, analyzing already published literature on the given topic. That's not usually we have the advantage of those three independent approaches of dealing with data. And we are lucky to spend time in the field as well as working in front of screen of your computer, but sometimes even in some hidden libraries. This is the Oxford Library, where David Luck and the others wrote their books, and some hidden treasures are there among the shelves. Well, and my background is mostly based with shorebirds. We have spent a lot of time working with those unique creatures, and again we could talk several hours about why and how exactly are those birds unique. But for some of you working on different systems, just a quick overview, and this is something what you can reach via our Elvonal web pages too, where we are currently working at many locations with those shorebirds. Well, but yeah, why shorebirds are so important, we will see quite soon. But today it will be not only about shorebirds, and we will really see lots of ongoing migrations. You are surely aware that many animals rely on long distance or short distance migration, and today it will be more about the long distance migrants, and we will limit ourselves on terrestrial ecosystems where we can stay firmly on land, and of course we know more about terrestrial animals than cetaceans or fishes, but of course there is a lot of migration going on as well. It's that we will concentrate on birds, bats, some ungulates, and several insect species like butterflies and dragonflies. Well, this is one of the example of one of the longest migration. The little, well, not so little bird, Arctic tern, is famous for traveling from Arctic to Antarctica, witnessing one of, well, this species witnessed probably the most of continuous daylight because it stays in the Arctic where there is no dark, and the same in the Antarctic. It's experiencing the night only when crossing the tropical regions. And this is just an example of journeys of those birds going from Svalbard archipelago in Arctic, going down and winter around Antarctica, and then returning back. You can see that there is a S-shaped loop, and it's obvious that the birds are able to track the conditions and adapt their journeys according to tailwind, according to some food resources along the way. That's that such migration behavior can be really complex and dependent on many factors and not being so straightforward. Some record months are definitely among shorebirds too. Some of those at the red knot or bar-tailed godwit, wintering around tropics or south temperate regions and breeding really in high remote Arctic. Really huge record man is bar-tailed godwit, and via satellite tracking it was found that those birds usually follow the route from Australia or New Zealand along the coast, along the Asia, up to the north, to the breeding grounds in like Alaska or Chukotka. But on the way back to the wintering grounds, they are able to do non-stop flights directly from Alaska to New Zealand. It takes them up 10 to 12 days according to the tailwind, and they cover distance longer than 10,000 kilometers. And during the non-stop flight, because there is no place to stop, they are burning half of their body weight. It's not, you can imagine the exceptional adaptations for migrating behavior. And then there is not surprising that nearly none of those birds die during the winter. There is so harsh barrier that the unlucky and less in the worst condition birds end up in the sea, that there is no overwintering mortality on New Zealand for those birds. Well, and we know, unfortunately, that many migrating birds or animals in general perform worse than their counterparts. Here we have two examples. One is well known from Netherlands, where researchers showed that the long-distance migrants are performing worse in population trends over several years, but only in the forest areas, forest birds like flycatchers, where there is high peak in food supply, whereas in the marshlands the food is more evenly distributed, and they presume that the mismatch with the food supply from caterpillars, because of quicker springs, those birds are suffering, unable to feed their young, and declining in numbers. We know that we are losing migrating birds quite quickly. This is actually just 10 years from 2007 to 2017, and it's obvious that I think around 14% of all passerines or birds migrating through US have been lost. There was such decline in biomass of migrating birds recorded by the radar. And having a contribution from shorebirds, we again now that the migrating species are performing worse than the resident ones, and migratory distance or migratory behavior was one of the drivers of population dynamics on the global population scale. This is a similar example showing that shorebirds in more temperate and Arctic regions, usually those ones who migrate longer distances, are really experiencing higher proportion of declining species than species in tropics or south hemisphere. Well, and we have known, or we have lived with the idea that we know what's happening and what's mostly limiting those species. And in case of shorebirds, there was a lot of changes happening on stopover sites or wintering sites along their flyways. Those species usually depend on mudflats, which is the intertidal zones with lots of mollusks and other invertebrates to feed on. But we know that in China or Korea or many places, such habitats are quickly changed, converted to arable land, to cities, to some in construction places, and then those birds lose their suitable feeding sites. Their adult survival deteriorate, or they can eventually die. This example of iconic spoonbill sandpiper. That's why we have lived with the idea that shorebirds or migratory animals are on average limited mostly by the factors affecting them during wintering or on stopover sites. It's hunting pressure, disturbance, and most importantly, habitat loss. But we have lived that with the idea that their breeding grounds are like pristine places where they can go and successfully breed and raise their young. Well, and we can use the situation for a moment to think about possible advantages for migrating to the north. It's not just a simple question. Who has read the 3 articles which we will talk mostly about today? Don't hesitate to raise a hand up. Well, that's great that not many of you have read it, because exactly you can right now think about it loudly and let me know what's your opinion. Why an animal, bird, mammal, what you are fancy about should migrate to the north? What are the possible benefits for the animal at the breeding grounds? Why animals would do such a long journey to reproduce far in the north? Exactly. That's a great idea. What more with foraging, not only the continuous daylight, but what's generally assumed about
for species which are diurnal.
Definitely, continuous daylight is one of them, helping to use the sources of food. But how does it work with the food in the Arctic? Or as far as you go to the north, is there less or more food than in the tropics? More, and why and when?
More during the breeding time. Low diversity, but equivalent for higher biomass.
Exactly. That's not. We know that yeah, in the tropics there is plentiful food, but more or less the same amount during the year, and lot of competition for it. Whereas as far we go to the north, there is more seasonal situation when during the peak summer there is a big emergence of lots of arthropods, and it's really paradise for feeding, and that's one of the important advantages why many animals migrate to the north, to have less competitors there and lots of food. At the same time, the food is more available for them because of continuous daylight, and at the same time, the structure of the habitat is a little bit less complex than in the tropics, and the same amount of food is more available for them. That's not, we have the food advantage, one of the main important advantages why animals migrate to the north. What else comes?
For example, I'm not sure about it, but if the food webs are less complex and there are less connections between the species, I guess that there are less parasites.
Great guess, and it has been presumed, and it's considered in this way that far to the north we go, there are less parasites, and some of the species might use the migration behavior to really escape from predation, from pressure from parasites. All right, anything else on your mind? It slipped out of my lips, and exactly. Again, it was presumed that in the Arctic it's lower predation pressure. Would you be able to explain why, or what was the idea behind it? Uh-huh. Yeah, well, the idea is that in the Arctic there is not necessarily smaller amount of predators, but the lower diversity. And the higher diversity of predators in the tropics might be more difficult for the breeding animal to adapt to at the same time. And again, this is the scenario how it could work. All right, well, we have covered some of the most important advantages. Anything else on your mind why you would travel to the north to reproduce there? Lack of what?
Mangrove vegetation. And the mangrove farming.
Yeah. Well, not so many of those birds really breed on the mudflats because the mudflats are regularly flooded. They are a little bit nearby, but yeah, you are right. The mudflats far in the north might be more exposed and possibly having more food for birds there. But yeah, to be honest, the Arctic mudflats are usually a little bit poorer in like productivity comparing to tropical ones actually, and there the birds rely more on the invertebrates in the small shallow pools nearby the ocean. But definitely interesting idea. Anything else? Well, if not, I think that we are well equipped to progress further, and we have really covered all those most important ideas. That's that there has been definitely less intense pressure when going up to the north. The farther north you go, there should be less parasites and pathogens, and at the same time there is high peak in food supply, which can support breeding animals. Well, but we also know that the current world is changing quite rapidly, and there are two major possible drivers, which is the climate change and human pressure, impacting many temperate and Arctic breeding grounds. And we had already some example from our well-known shorebirds, where we have shown that there was indeed the predicted humpback shape pattern in nest predation for shorebirds, but only before the year 2000. And quite recently there has been a bigger change in the North and Arctic region. many possible factors might be involved, including the spreading of predators northwards, vegetation structure changes, but most prominently we think that lack of the main prey for Arctic predators, the lemmings, might play one of the important roles, because we know that around the year 2000 or just before, at many Arctic sites, the regular cyclicity of the lemmings has diminished, or their numbers crashed down, presumed as a consequence of rain on snow event during the warmer winters, where the snow cover melt and freeze, and then those lemmings are unable to get food under the snow cover. It's a climate change mediated lack of main prey for Arctic predators. In such cases, predators which are still around eat more nests of shorebirds as a possible alternative prey. It's not the fact that the fox would like change the preference and search more for nests. It's opportunistic predator, and if there are many lemmings, the same fox just run out of the den, grab the first lemming, return back, whereas if there are not so many lemmings, the same fox needs to go zigzag, run through the tundra and see what's in there, and there is higher chance that it will predate the nest of shorebird in such situation. Well, that's not today. We will concentrate and follow a little bit this article, where we have highlighted that we have known that climate change and human pressure can affect some parts or some possible advantages, but nobody has put it so far into the perspective that it can really change profitability of migration behavior. And now we will go quickly through some examples. Let's not we know, for example, that there are usually phenological mismatches in the Arctic. It can go like any direction. That's that the peak of the insect can precede or follow the peak of the breeding of shorebirds. But on average, we know that the peak is a little bit earlier. Those long-distance migrants arrive later in comparison to phenological changes, and their chicks hatching later may suffer malnutrition and lower growth rates and eventually higher mortality. Here we have two examples of parasites spreading to the north. This is the example of one acanthocephalan parasite using the common eider as a main host, but quite recently, due to global warming, spreading to other naive hosts, so far with really low transmission, but extending its impact and possible pressure. Here we have the example of lungworm for caribou migrating ungulates in the Canadian Arctic, and those layers are the amount of days needed for the complete life cycle completion of the parasite. And it's obvious that only recently this parasite can complete the cycle in Victoria Island, for example. It was not possible a decade ago. It's again just showing the pressure of parasites going up to the north. And here is the example of mentioned shorebirds already, where you can see that there is increase in the nest predation all over the globe, but somewhere it is not so significant, whereas in the Arctic we see a rocket increase in nest predation after year 2000. Well, and what those things in total means, or how we could approach this idea and establish a suitable framework how to really address in future those migration profitability situations, is here we have used the pulse press framework, and we can divide the stressors or use the continuum of pulse press framework, really showing that some of those changes happened quite quickly, and then it returned back to the previous situation, which is, for example, the example of some abrupt disease outbreak which can act during 1 or 2 years, possibly killing many animals, but then not acting at all, and there is the possible recovery. This is the situation of saiga antelopes, for example, in Kazakhstan, I think in 2015, because of warmer temperatures, they had some gut disease killing nearly 80% of the population in those Kazakhstan places, but since then they are recovering back. Or we know that there was a cholera outbreak for birds, eiders mostly in Canadian Arctic, but again it's only temporal situation and possibly improving afterwards. But on the other hand, there are several chronic stressors, more pressing events where the situation is not really improving. You can imagine the loss of ice sheet or really loss of high Arctic tundra habitats because of shrubification as one of those actors, or increasing temperatures stressing the birds. At the same time, if you have repeatedly higher predation rates, it can go to the pressing events. That's that you can imagine the continuum. For example, if you have 1 year mismatch with the food supply, it might be the pulse event. But if you repeatedly experience over the years mismatch with the food, it can precipitate into being a chronic stressor and affecting the populations of the migrating species in long term, and unfortunately in a negative way. We need to think about those migration profitability changes from a spatial perspective too. That it's good to ask how big proportion of land or continent is really affected by this. We can have local examples, as is Arctic skuas breeding near UK on small archipelagos, having limited amount of food recently and having steep decline in the local population. But at the same time, you can have situations affecting maybe less deep and less negatively the migrating individuals, but affecting them on the much higher scale. In total, definitely contributing more to loss of migrating animals. It's important to note that we should be able to map the stressors across time and space as well. For sure, climate change or habitat destruction can work at nearly any scale, but more probably the volcanism can be abrupt change affecting huge distances, whereas hunting can affect usually just a small amount of place, and there are some long-term stressors as agriculture intensification going on for many decades. What's important to think of is as well the implications for population dynamics of those species, because if there are any changes in those advantages for migratory behavior, you can ask what are the responses, and the animal could somehow adapt to the changing environment, usually via some phenotypic plasticity in a shorter ecological perspective, or some physiological adaptation, rather than really adaptation sensu stricto, because it would take more time. Or if those animals are unable to adapt, then they suffer in lower reproductive output and in total declining population trends. Well, there are two examples of brant geese which tried to adapt to the changing conditions. In their case, they are having stopover site in Netherlands and really feeling that the spring is around the corner. That's that they are able to accelerate their migration towards the high Arctic breeding grounds. but there they arrive with lower energy stores and they need to refuel anyway before egg laying. That's not, unfortunately, the goslings in the end might have the mismatch with the plant phenology in this case and lower survival. And for example, red knot can like perceive the predation pressure or predation risk at the given sites. It's quite obvious that several shorebird species do avoid on long term, for example, Svalbard archipelago for breeding, because the Svalbard archipelago was lacking naturally any rodents. Quite recently there are a few voles, but otherwise they are just the predators, and it was postulated that the lack of lemmings or the more intense predation pressure is the fact that several shorebird species do avoid Svalbard for breeding at all, even if they are breeding in similar latitudes on other places. And this is fine, but if there are many places like this where there is like elevated predation pressure, then of course it really limits the maneuverable possibilities of those animals. That's in total. Unfortunately, such things happen so quickly that despite some possible adaptations and improvements, majority of the animals are unable to cope with all of those changes, and somehow they are affected by the current environmental changes. It's good to think from the perspective of the individual sites or regions to really think which places, regions or species are those ones where there are no changes or even improvement in migration profitability, or which places suffer from altered migration profitability, but it's still advantageous. It's still advantageous, but maybe less than it used to be before, and which places are degraded environment or possible ecological threat for migrating birds. Just quickly, the concept of ecological trap is the situation when climate change or human-made changes in the good-looking habitat at the beginning, attracting the animals to breed in, result in maladaptive behavior and lower reproductive outcomes. And for example, plowed field looks perfect at the beginning for breeding lapwings because it's without a vegetation, nicely structured habitat. But poor birds do not know that 20 days later the whole field will be managed for cultivation and all the clutches destroyed. That's not in case of ecological traps. There are the better, maybe not so perfectly looking, but better options nearby for the breeding animals. If they would choose, let's say, pasture nearby, lapwings would perform better. Whereas in case of completely degraded environment, there are no suitable alternatives nearby. It's not the whole habitat, whole region was affected by the given situation. That's not if the animal would move 100 kilometers elsewhere, probably the result would be the same. It's just a terminology differences among those two terms. And again, now we see that migratory birds, here again example for shorebirds who do perform quite strongly migration behavior and following several flyways. We know that it's not only the hunting pressure or habitat disturbance and loss, but also climate change and human pressure can impact on breeding grounds, yielding in the situation that those animals are under dual threats. It's that on wintering and staging areas, it's impacting their survival, and on top of that, possible trophic mismatch, increased predation or more parasites far in the north might again impact on their own survival, but more importantly in lower reproduction. And population dynamics consist of those two major components, survival and reproduction output. In the end, it's not surprising that unfortunately many migrating animals are in stronger decline than their resident counterparts, and that unfortunately majority of shorebirds are declining as sentinels, really promoting our understanding of those changes. Well, but it's important to ask which stage is crucial for which species, or which factor is really the one limiting the population dynamics, being able then better forecast what could change. Here just a slide about again using shorebirds as an example, because having such important changes at least some of the breeding grounds, some birds or animals in general might really trade off whether it's really worth of the traveling to the north or returning from the north back. It's important to know that climate change is helping many migrating animals to shorter their migrating routes back when going for winter. So this is definitely helping them. Grey-lag goose, for example, traveled usually to Morocco or North Africa to spend winter there, but nowadays they are more common through winter here, and it's definitely helping them. Similarly, it could work even for some shorebirds, but on the contrary, if along the migration and on breeding grounds I'm experiencing several negative impacts affecting my condition, then I would think whether I should really travel again next year back to the north. And we do know that some of the adults, for example, are able to skip breeding opportunity because of many possible factors, but one of them could be the higher unpredictability and higher demand of the migration and reproduction itself than it used to be in the past. And that I would suggest that nowadays we should see if this is happening, if on the given change population or given flyway there are such negative impacts present, then we would probably see a higher percentage of adult birds skipping the breeding opportunity and staying overwintering on those wintering grounds in those cases. And such investigations are already happening. That's that we will see what will be in there and how we could approach this issue from the conservation perspective. That you have seen that the migratory animals are really sensitive to many changes, dependent on many places along their life cycle. And if you take out one stone from the mosaic, the whole population can crash. But on the other hand, every little helps, and we can start from direct nest protection on some breeding grounds, as example of here, which works well, but it's demanding and affecting just one nest to regional management, preparing better habitats, breeding places for migratory birds, to establishing international networks and bigger conservation measures, because of course migratory animals do not know the borders, and in the same way the conservation really need to be well international. And when thinking about the Arctic itself, it would be good to prevent some other drilling and mining activities there. We know that as ice is retreating, and new minerals and places are discovered there, and many places in the Arctic are quite unprotected right now. At the same time, would be good to manage better the waste disposal, because we know, for example, that behind some Arctic villages there are big piles of waste supporting generalist predators, and those predators then affect quite a large area around, elevating the predation pressure. Well, in temperate region, the situation is more complex, and again, we could think and spend discussing for a long time what's happening there. But agriculture intensification is an important issue for sure. Spreading urban areas and at the same time lower connectivity of the whole landscape. Birds can fly, but ungulates need roam on the ground, and if there are big railways or fences, it can really hamper the migration at all. Similarly, wind turbines, for example, do not help birds or bats to migrate, and there are many obstructions in our recent landscapes. Well, we have discussed those ideas for long-distance migrants on land, terrestrial long-distance migrations, but we can ask how those things are relevant or how those aspects are precipitating for short-distance migrants or partial or nomadic distance migrant species. As a nomadic species is here the snowy owl, which can track the conditions in the Arctic, but can be still affected. At the same time, we can ask how does it work in other regions. We know that across Africa, there are going on big animal migrations, usually big herds of ungulates, tracking the suitable conditions. But we know that Sahel is getting drier, and that some changes in such conditions are happening there too, maybe affecting the migration profitability as well. And we do not know, or at least I do not know well, how does this could precipitate for non-terrestrial taxa. That's again fish or cetaceans might be affected as well, but it could work completely differently in the marine or freshwater habitats. Well, and I think that it's not that it's important to not stopping by the publication. Always is good to take our time to really disseminate the results and help press release officers and journalists to spread the word, because I think that the awareness of the public is the key for successful conservation actions. So that we should talk about it. In this case, I was lucky that while being in Peru, the media did pick it up themselves. That's not so huge work was demanding from my perspective. I was surprised how many countries and people were really approached by this news, including some gamers spending time not gaming but reading about shorebirds, which is nice. Hopefully it was the true. In some of those contributions, you just can guess what's in there. That's about your research, hoping that it's translated well, and you just try to make sure that journalists pick it up correctly and not tweak the information. Sometimes it's easier, sometimes not. But in total, I think it helps. It helps your research. It helps the species. It helps. Like the science in general being recognized and helping to conservation actions. Well, and to answer the question from the beginning, whether the migration behavior it's still beneficial, I hope yes. I still hope that on many places it's still beneficial and the birds really or animals profit from it. But unfortunately, it's probably less than it used to be, and it's definitely a good time to investigate such migration profitability in details, trying to understand our species, to make sure that the miracle of migration will stay with us and that we will not continue losing many more migrating animals. Well, that's everything from my side. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to discussion, and let's end with more positive slide.
Thank you for this great talk, and congratulations for your publication. One of the questions that I thought about reviewing your lecture was if you have any data regarding the shortening of migratory distance for these species as we see in other species here in Europe, and regarding the costs of maybe staying near the breeding sites all year round for these species.
Well, you can imagine that there are many migrating systems, many species with many examples. That's not here for the article. We restricted ourselves to the long-distance migrants who are affected probably the most because they do not know what's happening on their breeding grounds. That's not, we have not considered short-distance migrants, and we could talk quite a lot about how does it impact them. I think that there might be impact similarly, maybe less pronounced, given the fact that they can really perceive what's happening nearby. They can postpone the migration, because they are seeing what's happening in Hungary when they are wintering, for example, in Mediterranean, tracking the conditions more nicely. But at the same time, they might be affected by intensification of agriculture, some climate changes. I think that they are affected as well, but probably less than long-distance migrants. That would be my guess. And again, we could discuss various case studies, but this is the broader picture, I would guess. It could happen. We know that it's happening for example, those grey-lag goose. It's happening for cranes, for example, that they are searching new wintering grounds closer to the breeding grounds. This is definitely one of the possible advantage, and it's happening. We know that, for example, the geese are like profiting from some agriculture changes. There are definitely groups or animals who, let's say, profit from climate change, and it could shorter their migratory distance. But on average, probably more birds or animals are affected negatively by the ongoing changes. Well, we have some shorebirds who like do smaller migratory moves recently, but I'm not sure whether there are like any detailed studies showing that by doing so they helped themselves. They are usually facing the same threats on the breeding grounds. That's not, yeah, what we are trying to search. It's whether those like migratory decisions, migrate or not, migrate longer or not, will affect the population dynamics in the long term run, but such data are scarce so far, for shorebirds at least.
You showed the bird map maybe 2 times during the presentation, where the different stressors or threats were marked, and also some parts of the bird were outlined. So my question are those the different typical migratory routes of the birds that outline different areas? And does this mean that in different migratory routes there are different stress or different threats which are typical to different parts of the bird?
Could be. Those 8 flyways are recognized mostly for shorebirds, but used by other birds as well, and they are marking like several species usually using the given flyway. There are some species using even more flyways, but we know, for example, that many species breeding in Alaska can either migrate through like Asia or even up to Europe, or doing via Americas. That's not those, and some of those flyways are more secure in others. In other terms, see, for example, now that around the Yellow Sea, the East Asia flyway is actually experiencing a lot of reclamation works going on and habitat loss. But unfortunately, this is happening along other flyways too. We know, for example, that in South America there is higher hunting pressure probably than elsewhere. But yeah, some of those drivers are the same for all the flyways, and we know that some flyways are more, unfortunately, famous for some threats going on there.
Okay, that was too complicated to have a complete understanding based on a very
Well, this is just highlighting that there are several migratory systems which birds usually do, that they can be quite complex, and that there are complex drivers who can really like press on the birds, and those are along the migration on wintering grounds as well as on the breeding grounds.
So in each article that we see with any kind of species bearing GPSs or repair tags or any kind of movement recording device, we see that these birds are really able to fly long distances in quite short time. So I would guess distance is not a real problem for them. Do you know about any kind of impediment that would result in this mismatch? So why didn't they just fly them? What is the mechanism behind it that they cannot track more properly these changes?
Well, I think that is the luck of the continent, or a big space gap in between the wintering grounds and breeding grounds. That's that if the bird is wintering somewhere in tropical Americas, it does not know that already spring started in Canada or Arctic, and it relies on some evolutionary clocks, or it like follow the day and night like biorhythms to know what worked really well over the millennia to start the migration from here and be here in time. But the quick changes in the north do not translate well into those genes of those birds. They say, oh, right now I need to do it quicker. It's not they follow what worked well over the millennia, but unfortunately it's not working currently. It's not, they arrive from the breeding grounds and realizing, oh, it's already late to some extent. Or they try to breed quickly, but yeah, then for example the peak of the food supply is when they are still sitting on the eggs, and then later hatching chicks can get a smaller amount of arthropods than they would get if the timing would be perfect.
So, yeah, then no questions, and thank you for that for the full talk. Let's see you at lunch. Thank you, and see you all next week.
Thank you very much.